So I'm here to talk to Dash about Cosplayers, Perfect Collection, which is a truly wonderful book. I was thinking the other day that I think it's the best thing I've read about comics in a very, very long time, since like Stephen Millhauser writing about comics a long time ago. It's one of the most insightful books I've ever read about the medium and also about the world around the medium, which is hardly ever chronicled. It's like if you were really into rock music and you got to read an entire book about rock fandom or all the things that happen around a rock and roll show and during a rock and roll show. It has that kind of intimacy to it. And as with most things, everything I've ever read of Dash's, it has a tremendous amount of love and empathy in it, which I found extremely moving because it's very easy to make fun of quote unquote like nerd culture or whatever. It's much, much harder to find meaning in it and love and then bring it out and communicate the nuances of it to a wider audience. So I love this book.
Thanks for saying that.
I'm very happy to be here. This is the book. Make sure you get a copy. So Dash, one thing I wanted to start off with that kind of gets at the gist of it is the subtitle, Perfect Collection, which...
Okay.
Yeah, I know what it is. Well, why don't you say what it is, and then you could maybe also say when you first encountered it, because I actually didn't know what it was until like 3 days ago when I was messing around online.
Oh, because you thought, why is it called Perfect Collection?
Yeah.
Well, in anime box sets, things were collected, and they would always call them perfect collections. So the original animations, that there would be like a 4-episode miniseries, and they would come out on VHS, and then they would be collected, and first they would call them perfect collections, and then like Crying Freeman would come out in individual pamphlets, and then Dark Horse would collect them into smaller perfect bound books and call it Crying Freeman Perfect Collection Volume 1. So the idea is that they had perfectly collected everything prior and put it into like...
I love the idea of perfection.
Yeah, yeah.
Like we've achieved perfection in collecting
I always
these.
thought it was a funny thing too. And I was always surprised that no other state's kind of cartoonist had used it. It seemed like an obvious good idea to call something.
Yeah, but you could only use it for this book in a way because... why don't you... Dash covers a lot of ground in this book. Get to learn about manga scholars, anime fans, a comic shop owner. The big omission in the book that makes one of the reasons it works so well is the omission of the comic book artist. So everything you're reading in the book is around the comic book object, the book. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about growing up and being involved in the world of fandom, of manga and anime fandom, and your experience with it, and then also moving in a way out of that world and into the sort of, for lack of a better term, like lit comics world, which doesn't have that kind of fandom. It has a version of it, but a kind of fandom that doesn't want to call itself fandom.
Well, the first part is that I think I grew up at like the perfect time to catch the manga anime wave. So I was born in '83, and then during the '90s was where every time you'd go into a comic shop or a video rental store, there would be like 2 more Japanese cartoons. So I could follow everything as it was coming out. First there'd be Akira and New Dominion Tank Police, and then you'd go back next week and they'd have like a third one, and you'd rent that one. And it was still when the anime conventions, Otakon was pretty big, but there were still these tons of small in a hotel comic conventions where you'd end up hanging out with the people that were on the panels. There would be 3 other artists that would be like 17 years old, and they had bought a artist alley table where there were like 3 other, the artist alley was like 3 tables. And it exploded, by like 2000, it got huge. And now, obviously there's a ton out there. So I just had a lot of experience. That was kind of my teenage years, because I was so intensely into comic books. And so and it was there were I remember like a friend, his name was Keisan, and he would talk about like making a Hadouken, like a fireball that they use in Street Fighter. So he would talk about like driving his car and holding his hand out of his windshield to be able to like gather energy into his hand. There was like extreme levels of fandom where you were like trying to like bring these things from the imaginary world into reality, and cosplay, I think is like, that's part of why I like it, is that it's like fandom is part of it, but it's also like reaching into this imaginary world and trying to recreate it with these tools that you have. Yeah, what was the other part of your? What?
I mean, then you started making the things themselves. I mean,
I was making them.
You were a very young published
I was
cartoonist.
making them then.
Yeah.
I'm glad you haven't seen any of those. But no, I always made comics. Always like.
And did you cosplay as well?
When this book was announced, they had some news service found a cosplay picture of me and ran it with it. So there is photo evidence of this, and even but that was like the most recent one. There is some from the late 90s, but I was never really I never got hardcore into it. It was more like I was hardcore into comics.
Right.
But I would think, I think the last time I wanted to make a Guyver suit. That was my
Guyver?
last. Bio booster armor, kind of like a Japanese action guy.
And what's the appeal, the specifically Japanese appeal? Because you're also pretty into sort of all kinds of manga and all kinds of Japanese film. So didn't you do an exchange program in Japan as well?
I did, but because I got into it. But I think my dad read comics, so the other forms of comics were around. There were underground comics. I saw lots of American superhero comics, and so the Japanese comics felt new then, and they felt really like my dad didn't know about them. He was like a geeky guy, and they were like really exciting when they were arriving. They were like 3,000 pages long. They were drawn sometimes in a really weird way, like weird in like that they were just like at the speed of thought almost.
Right.
Some of those comics, and yeah. But then when I got into the literary comics, the people there who were the same age as me were doing like the DIY 90s scene stuff, like the Spit and a Half zine, and I never paid attention to any of that. And I thought that they were much cooler and with it. The fan, I guess why isn't there like that degree of fandom?
There is a tremendous degree of fandom in that world, which is sort of borne out in all like the million small press expos all over the country all the time. But I guess it takes a different form. I mean, is it more consumer based, like less participatory? What?
The fandom in literary comics?
Yeah.
Well, they're fans of the creators and not the characters.
Right. That's yeah.
That's a big difference.
Yeah.
And I kind of think it's almost the cartoonist's fault that we haven't generated like really very many striking characters. Don't you think?
Oh, well, yeah, you can count them on one finger, basically. There's like Jimmy Corrigan.
Yeah, I don't know if people want to cosplay as.
Oh. You mean for cosplaying purposes. Right.
I thought you were wondering, like, why aren't there more cosplayers at SPX? And I wonder that, too. No one's cosplaying here, really?
No. Well, something to strive for. Speaking of striking characters, there's a great parallel to Dan Clowes's Ghost World in this book, both because of the two female characters who are friends and kind of in their own world, and also in a very specific part where they secretly film this guy as part of their ongoing movie series. But Ghost World is a deeply cynical book. I mean, Clowes kind of obviously loves the two girls, but it's a cynical and kind of disaffected book. And in your case, the two girls are not standing outside of the culture looking in, but they're in it and kind of trying to get further in and make sense of it while they're in it. And I just wondered if you could talk about sort of looking at Ghost World and what that meant to you, and also just working with that over your shoulder while you were doing this book.
I didn't think about it, and I had done it in issues. So the idea was that they were originally pamphlet comics, so that you would go into a comic shop and you would see Batman and Superman, and then you would see cosplayers of Batman and Superman right next to them, and kind of put them on the racks there.
Right.
So the first issue came out, and Eric Reynolds, who's the publisher at Fantagraphics, who obviously is a #1 Dan Clowes fan, was, I think, the first person to tell me that this is like Ghost World. And then other people said that too. And so then when it came to the second issue, I thought it would be funnier, or more like delusional or something, to try to make it more like a Dan Clowes comic rather than less like one, you know?
Right.
So I have like the critic character, who's I feel like very like a Dan Clowes, Clowesian critic character.
Yeah.
But I love Ghost World. I didn't reread it for this or anything, but it's in the back there, and it was also when I was drawing these when he was having the retrospective and all of this stuff. So I would read all of the interviews with him because and he would just say the same things at each one, but I'd still read them for some reason. Those characters, it was very much like a 90s alternative thing, like that they were outside of culture and DIY, and the cosplayers are like that. They have that DIY part, but they also have something that I think of as more aughts or present tense, where it's like participating in like giant mainstream commercial culture, like how independent filmmakers now, it seems like you're supposed to make like a superhero movie or something, or people it isn't there is I don't sense among people an attitude of like all popular culture sucks, you know, the way it did in the 90s, and that Dan Clowes definitely had. And he would do the Dan Pussy comics that were like really negative on comics
vicious
fandom, and
cartoonists.
And I remember I think I had dinner with him once, and I said I could really feel like the hate like emanating from these comic pages, you know? And he said, yeah, well, I would be like at a comic festival with the Hernandez brothers, like these geniuses, and there would be a line around the block for like the bozo who's inking Batman, and the Hernandez and I would just be like alone. And that was just every time he would go out, and that was his, you know, for years. So, but I mean, the Hernandez brothers don't seem to carry that hatred in them. It's just probably his personality.
Oh, I mean, I think it was also part of an attitude in the 80s and 90s, just in alternative culture in general. I mean, it was just a huge pushback, because you see it in Gilbert Hernandez, and you see it in Bag and Ware, and I mean, it begins with Crumb in a way in cartooning, the kind of real pushback against contemporary culture, and it's disappeared now for the most part, which is a shame, because it would be useful. Tell me a bit about Osamu Tezuka, because he's a big part of the book as sort of a godhead figure for the scholar who's kind of an amazing impersonation of what comics scholars are really like, which is pretty scary. Because there is this culture, well, that's a side note.
I kind of make fun of him, but I feel like that's because I relate to him the most.
Oh, yeah. You're prostrating yourself in a way.
Or
like the autodidact nature of it.
Just that I like Tezuka a lot too. I don't know. I kind of just like associate more with
right.
that. And I've done like lots of I don't know,
panel discussions.
Yeah.
But what is the appeal? I mean, you are the biggest Tezuka fan I know.
I'm really. I believe you when you say that, and I'm shocked because I don't understand why more States cartoonists aren't looking at Tezuka. And when I read their comics, I can tell they don't read Tezuka.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Because he's like Hitchcock to me, where like he learned how to make like a chase scene exciting. You know, like you look at a lot of States comics and it's like a chase scene, a car chase scene will just be one panel of a car behind another car.
Right.
And that's really it. But Tezuka would know you would put it over 3 pages, you would have tall, you know, vertical panels of the car turning the road, you turn the page, you see the car moving around. He like realized how to use the graphic elements of comics and move it through time in an exciting way. He also is the only cartoonist who could really explain complicated stuff super clearly and easily. Like the beginning of Ayako, it's like moving through generations of families and time, and like no other cartoonist has. They would make it confusing. They would put it on one page. You'd kind of have to decipher this. I think he was really great at like the book that you published, the Mysterious Underground Men.
For a second,
it's
forgot.
like
I forgot for a second. I published Tezuka.
It has this plane crashing and the opening spreads, and it's just the best plane crash you've ever seen. And then it goes into the hospital room, and the segue into the hospital room is a page that's just a door. Do you remember? That's like hospital.
Yeah.
So it's like a crash, and then you turn the page and you see a door, and you open the door, and you're in this scene, and it's these long. And he would change tones. The funny stuff was funny, the scary stuff was scary. Even when he was like pervy and messed up, it always seemed like it came from that he was just kind of generating stories, like he was watching TV and trying to think of like a gangster story. When you think about what his personal life was like, I think it ends when he was like a child collecting insects, because from every moment after that he's just drawing comics. So in all of his comics, it's this insect theme, and the other thing is that I really like that it's these larger than life figures that he was called the god of manga, and there's stories about him, and that's appealing, these people like Disney, and so the fact that he's a great artist, and also it's there's all this funny stuff about him I like.
What about the economy of the drawing?
I think that it actually adds, sometimes the clip art quality of it makes you wonder where it goes to maybe this has nothing to do with reality, or he's elsewhere. He's just plotting. He's just creating a plot. Like he'll draw things that are horrific, but it's in a very clip art looking style where you don't know if he's really with those characters. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, completely. There's a remove, but that makes it even more compelling.
More interesting to me.
Speaking of favorite comics, the final story in the book is Escape from Nostalgia World, which is this great, almost final story in the book. There's a great story about going into a comic book shop and finding a comic that you love, and then this character who I have to believe intentionally looks like Jerry Moriarty. And if not, wow.
Well, there's a lot of people that look like that,
Yes, I know.
That have comic shops across the country.
I know. I worked in one. But what he articulates kind of beautifully in that story is that comics have this transformative power, that you can alter them, you can cut them up and make collages, they can transform your consciousness, comics can transform and degrade or upgrade over time. And I wondered if that was, and I know you're not this kind of artist, but nevertheless, would you consider that in retrospect a kind of philosophy of cartooning for you? Or am I stretching?
Well, I think the main mission there was, you'd always see comics talked about in this, to me, not a kind of weak way. When people, I wanted to, the thing with every comic review was oh, I didn't know a comic could do that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
You really show how the form can do. I didn't know a comic could do that. And I wanted to be no, a comic can, heal the sick and kill someone and put a lot of power in there. Yeah. Because, they're consciousness altering objects that we're surrounded by here and shape culture, and so that was the main goal. And then also it was funny that he has this shop, that we hear his backstory and how kind of comics changed his whole life, and now he's really pushing it on people who come in there. And that was that similarly to how I had experienced at those kind of middle of the road anime conventions, or not middle, far off remote kind of anime conventions in hotels that I had never seen a story about. Whenever I saw comic book shop owners in pop culture, it was the comic book guy. They were kind of mean, geeky, snobby guys, but there's this whole other world that I hadn't seen that's the stoner, has this weird, we don't know if he sold anything that day, how he keeps this shop running.
Well, there was a type when I was going, I think there was a type of comic shop owner as educator.
Oh, yeah.
That was kind of an amazing thing to grow up with.
That's like how, right, the people at Radio Shack used to be like the real experts.
Yeah. Whereas you go into a comic store like Barbarian Comics in Wheaton, Maryland, way out in suburban Maryland, and you'd say, I'm looking for an EC comic or something, and he'd say, I've got it.
Yeah.
I've got just the one. And he'd go, and it would take like 20 minutes, and there'd be movement in the back, and then he'd come back with it, and indeed, it would be awesome.
Yeah.
It's a funny thing. Yeah, and it was like, it's also the medium, the things around the medium in comics are kind of the only way to get educated about it. Or I guess that was the case. It's a little less so now, but still, it's kind of like,
there isn't a textbook or anything.
There's no textbook. There's not a reliable history. And most of the people in charge of the histories are not reliable.
Right, because they're too fanish in particular areas, right? Is that why you would say that?
I would say it's a mixture of too fanish in particular areas and a lack of sophistication.
Huh.
So now I'm being mean.
Okay.
So I know what your next comic is, and it's drawn in a very different style. I mean, told in an entirely different style. And in each of your books, you've chosen a sort of narrative-specific way to render action and characters. I just wondered if you could talk about how you choose, well, first of all, what the next book is, and then how you choose the form for the narrative.
The story comes first, and then the story will kind of suggest how to execute it. So for this one, the idea of these characters cosplaying, I thought, like a traditional, pamphlet comic, black line, computer coloring, font lettering, like how commercial comics are produced, to kind of magically put them into what they're fans of. And for the one I'm working on now is a very different story about a Quaker soldier in the American Civil War that suggested Civil War era illustration. So it's like no panel borders, crow quill, pen lines, and it doesn't mean that I look. Usually, all it means is the tools and the scale and kind of the rules of it. So the way I draw is the same, and the sketches for them look the same, but then when I am executing them, a lot can change just based on the tool and scale, and no panel borders versus panel borders. And I know it's kind of confusing, especially because I've been doing it, but I have no choice. It's just how my brain is wired that the story kind of dictates these other elements.
Yeah, makes sense. We should open it up to questions.
Are we out of time?
Well, questions. Any questions?
If you want to raise your hand, I'll bring you a microphone.
Who's got it?
I just wanted to... hello, testing. I just wanted to know if this guy is from Body Worlds.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So that's from... that's kind of referencing how earlier in that same story, the Tezuka scholar is talking about how Tezuka had he thought of his characters as actors that he would cast into different storylines. So like the Verdi character from this, I cast into the High School Sinking movie. I like that idea because then it's almost like you get to see a different side of that person and then you don't have to think of how to draw a new person.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question?
He has one back there.
I don't know if I need a microphone. Thanks. Dan, thanks for being here. It's great to see you guys speak. I think I have a question that applies to both of you. Dan was my instructor in my senior year at Dash and I's alma mater, the School of Visual Arts. I also studied under Mazzucchelli. And I was curious if you could shed some light on what your career was like just after school. Maybe, Dan, did you play a part, or were you aware of Dash at that point? And how has that affected?
I don't want to hear this story.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, because I'm a year out of the same school, and in my time there, we were still very much in your shadow, so to speak.
Oh wow.
I won't go into details, but
please go into detail. No. Maybe you should go first. Well, the thing about
when did you graduate?
2005.
Right.
And I promptly left New York for a little bit and hung out in Richmond, Virginia. And I thought that was a good decision because I lived pretty inexpensively, and I drew a lot. I drew Bottomless Belly Button, that book. I drew Body World, the webcomic. There wasn't a heck of a lot to do in that area. So I was very, very prolific then. And then when they started coming out, I moved to Bed-Stuy around 2008. And then a lot of things happened for period. I did like the IFC series in 2009. I just was very prolific there for a long bit. And then I kind of burnt out. Like 2013, I got really exhausted and had to kind of pick myself up again. But I was kind of a workaholic even before SVA. I was a workaholic when I was 10 years old or something. Like when I said I was going to those conventions, I was making tons of comics when I was a teenager, and it just kept going, my career. It's weird to think of it. It's a career.
Something. I guess I think I first knew of Dash's. I think your first books were published before you were out of school, maybe.
Yeah, well, with comics, you don't. With comics, it isn't like you have a agent and then you get a publisher. It's just like you start making them.
I know, but I remember.
So I had like books for some reason that I made lots of copies of when I was in middle school.
Oh.
And then like in high school, I did illustrations for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. So I would go in to the office there and that they taught me. I would see it printed, and it was they would pay me. I was like a hired illustrator when I was probably more paid then than I could get paid now for illustration.
Better rate, yeah.
Yeah, at 16 or 17.
Yeah.
We got time for one or two more. Anybody else has one? I kind of had one. There's a list in the Tezukan story of I forget the character's name, but her favorite animes. Was that autobiographical? I think it was FLCL.
Oh no, that's who I thought she would like.
Yeah, because she has the
people
line
that my list is the convention itself. There's a going into the story. There's a page that's like the schedule for the convention. So so the idea is if I'm making a fictional anime convention to just screen the cartoons I really like. So it's a very personal list. that's there. That if you know those cartoons, you would be kind of perplexed why they would play like bizarre, like Maruo cartoon at like 2 p.m. or something. Yeah, but I try, I think that I wouldn't put my favorites into a character's mouth, that would be breaking the rule of the character, especially when they're fans, when part of their identity is what they like. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. Let's give it up
Thanks.
for Dan and Dash.